The Maple Creek redemption. The call came at 3:17 a.m., a time slot reserved for catastrophes. Mark Rizzo fumbled for his phone, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and delivered news that turned his world to ash. His father, Tony Rizzo, had suffered a massive heart attack. The doctors didn't know if he would make it 4 hours later. Mark was on a plane from San Francisco to the small, stubborn town of Maple Creek, Pennsylvania, a place he had spent the better part of his adult life trying to forget. The hum of the jet engines was a dull roar against the static in his mind. Dad. The word felt foreign, a relic from a life he'd boxed up and stored away. He thought of his father not as he was now, a 72-year-old man with a failing heart, but as the giant of his childhood. Tony Rizzo, with forearms thick as hams, a permanent smudge of motor oil on his cheek, and a laugh that could shake the rafters of the two-car garage he called his kingdom. He was the man who could fix anything, a carburetor, a leaky faucet, a wobbly table leg. Everything, it seemed, except the fractured relationship with his only son. And then there was his mother, Eleanor. Mark's chest tightened. If Tony was the roaring engine of the family, Eleanor was the quiet, steady battery. She was the one who packed lunches with neatly folded napkins, who soothed scraped knees, and who tried, with a quiet desperation, to bridge the chasm between her husband's stubborn practicality and her son's dreamy ambition. The last time he'd spoken to her, over a year ago, the conversation had been a minefield of polite, painful pleasantries. The plane descended through thick clouds, revealing a tapestry of lush, green hills and the serpentine gleam of the Susquehanna River. Maple Creek hadn't changed. It was still a town of red brick buildings, a single main street with a diner, a hardware store, and a bank, all clinging to the side of the river valley like lichen on a rock. He drove a rental car through the familiar streets, the scent of wet earth and blooming lilacs flooding him with a nostalgia that felt like a physical blow. The Rizzo house, a modest white colonial with a wide porch, stood at the end of a cul-de-sac. The garage door was closed. That alone felt wrong. Eleanor was waiting for him at the screen door. She looked smaller, the years having gently stooped her shoulders and etched fine lines around her eyes. But her smile, when it came, was the same, a little sad, a lot loving. "Key," she whispered, pulling him into a hug that smelled of laundry detergent and yeast. She was baking. Of course she was baking. In a crisis, Eleanor Rizzo made bread. "How is he?" Mark asked, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "Stable. Grumpy. The doctors say he'll need a long recovery. He can't be alone." She led him into the kitchen, the heart of the house. It was exactly as he remembered. Yellow Formica counters, a collection of ceramic chickens on the windowsill, the faint, ghostly smell of 1,000 Sunday gravy dinners. "What about you, Mom? Are you okay?" She waved a hand, a gesture of dismissal he knew well. "I'm fine. It's your father. And the business." The business. Rizzo's auto repair. The source of the fight. Tony had built it from nothing, a single bay that grew into the most trusted garage in the county. To him, it was a legacy. To Mark, a life sentence to greasy fingernails and small-town gossip. He had wanted to go to college for graphic design, to create worlds with a mouse and a screen, not get his hands dirty with the gritty reality of engines. The night he told them he was leaving for California, the fight had been nuclear. "Design. You want to draw pretty pictures on a computer?" Tony had roared, his face purple. "I built this for you. This is real. This puts food on the table. It's your dream, Dad, not mine. I don't want your life." Mark had shouted back. Eleanor had stood by the sink, silently weeping, a dish towel twisted in her hands. She was the Switzerland in the personal war, and both sides had accused her of treason for not picking one. "What about the business?" Mark asked, pouring himself a glass of water. "It's closed. Until he's back on his feet." Out a stack of envelopes. "The medical ones are starting to come, and the business mortgage is due. The savings, they're not what they used to be." A cold knot formed in Mark's stomach. He was a successful art director now. He lived in a sleek apartment with a view of the Bay Bridge. He could write a check, but he knew, with a certainty that felt like fate, that his father would rather burn the money than take it from him. "I'll handle it, Mom," he said, the words leaving his mouth before he could stop them. He went to the hospital that afternoon. The room smelled of antiseptic and wilted flowers. Tony Rizzo looked shrunken in the sterile white bed, a pale imitation of the formidable man he'd been. Tubes snaked from his arms. His eyes were closed. "Dad," Mark said softly. Tony's eyes fluttered open. They were the same dark, intelligent eyes, but clouded with pain and medication. He focused on Mark, and for a fleeting second, there was a spark of something, relief, maybe. Then the shutters came down. "You came?" Tony grunted, his voice a dry rasp. "Of course I came." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the steady beep of the heart monitor. "Your mother's worried," Tony finally said. "About the shop. I know. Don't worry about it, just focus on getting better." Tony turned his head away, looking out the window at the parking lot. "Bills don't stop just 'cause your heart does." It was the closest they would get to an admission of vulnerability. Mark left the hospital an hour later, the weight of his unthinking promise pressing down on him. "I'll handle it, but how?" The answer came the next morning, driven by a desperation he hadn't felt since he was a teenager trying to escape this town. He went to the garage. The closed sign hung crookedly on the chain-link fence. He used the spare key, still hidden under the same false rock, and let himself in. The smell hit him first: gasoline, grease, rubber. The scent of his childhood. The garage was a time capsule. Tony's tools hung in neat, shadowed outlines on the pegboard. 2 cars were in the bays: Mrs. Henderson's ancient Buick, waiting for a brake job, and a vintage, cherry red 1965 Mustang that Mark didn't recognize, its engine partially disassembled. An idea, both terrifying and absurd, began to form. He was a designer, not a mechanic. But he had grown up in this garage. He had handed his father tools, fetched parts, and absorbed the language of engines through osmosis. He knew the theory, even if his practical skills were rusty. He found the ledger on his father's cluttered desk. The Mustang belonged to Mr. Albright, the high school principal. He'd paid a hefty deposit for a full engine rebuild. A job Tony had been in the middle of. Mark's phone buzzed. It was his boss in San Francisco. "Mark, we need you back. The Henderson account is getting antsy. How long is this family emergency going to take?" I'm not sure," Mark said, his eyes fixed on the complex puzzle of the Mustang's engine. "A couple of weeks, maybe. A couple of weeks. We can't hold your projects that long." The ultimatum was clear. Mark thought of his father's face in the hospital bed. He thought of his mother's tired eyes. He thought of the stack of bills on the kitchen counter. "Then don't," Mark said, the words feeling both catastrophic and liberating. "I quit." He hung up, his hands trembling. He had just torched his career. For what? A garage he hated and a father who barely spoke to him. He drove back to the house, his mind reeling. Eleanor was in the garden, pulling weeds. He told her what he'd done. She stopped, her gloved hands resting on her knees, and looked at him with an expression he couldn't decipher. "Oh, Marky, it's the only way, Mom. I can finish the jobs in the shop. Bring in some cash. Keep the creditors off our backs until Dad's better." "But your job, your life in California. It'll be there, or it won't," he said, with more bravado than he felt. "Right now, this is more important." Tears welled in her eyes. She didn't argue. She just stood up, pulled off her gloves, and hugged him. "Your father, he won't understand. He'll see it as pity. I know, Mark said. But it's not. The next day, Mark became a mechanic. He started with Mrs. Henderson's Buick. He spent 3 hours just remembering how to safely lift the car on the hydraulic jack. He fumbled with the wrench, skinning his knuckles, cursing under his breath. He watched YouTube videos on his phone, pausing and rewinding, trying to translate two-dimensional instructions into three-dimensional reality. It took him 2 days to complete a job his father would have finished in 2 hours. But when he lowered the car and test drove it, the brakes held firm. A small, unexpected thrill of accomplishment coursed through him. He didn't tell his father. When he visited the hospital, they talked about the weather, the hospital food, the nurses. They talked about everything except the garage. It was a silent truce, a day built on the things they left unsaid. Eleanor became the go-between. She would bring Mark lunch at the garage, her eyes lighting up when she saw him, covered in grease, frowning in concentration. "You look like him, you know," she said one afternoon, handing him a meatball sandwich. "When you're focused like that, you have the same crease in your forehead." Mark grunted, non-committal, but the observation stuck with him. The real test was the Mustang. The engine rebuild was a complex, delicate dance. One wrong move and he could turn a collection of valuable parts into a very expensive paperweight. He laid out his father's tools, the worn sockets and ratchets feeling alien in his designer hands. He spent hours just cataloging the parts, comparing them to schematics he found online. He worked late into the night, the garage lit by a single, buzzing fluorescent light. The silence was different from the sterile quiet of his San Francisco office. Here, it was filled with the hum of the refrigerator where Tony kept his sodas, the distant cry of a train whistle, the chirping of crickets. It was a productive silence. One night, bleary-eyed and frustrated with a stubborn piston ring, he noticed a small, faded photo tucked into the corner of the workbench. It was of him, no more than 7 years old, sitting on the fender of a car, beaming with pride, while a younger, smiling Tony had his arm around him. Mark had completely forgotten that day. He stared at the photo for a long time, a lump forming in his throat. Weeks bled into a month. Tony was moved to a rehab facility. He was getting stronger, his color returning, his voice losing its raspy weakness. The silence between father and son was becoming heavier, strained by the unspoken truth of what Mark was doing. The breaking point came when Mr. Albright called the house, asking about his Mustang. Eleanor, flustered, told him it was being worked on. Mr. Albright, knowing Tony was ill, grew suspicious and decided to pay a visit to the garage. Mark was underneath the Mustang, tightening the oil pan. When he heard a car pull up, he slid out on the creeper to see Mr. Albright, now in his 70s but still possessing the stern demeanor of a principal, standing in the doorway. "Where's Tony?" Albright demanded, his eyes sweeping over the garage, noting the organized chaos. Mark got to his feet, wiping his hands on a rag. "He's in rehab, Mr. Albright. I'm his son, Mark. I'm finishing the job for him." Albright's eyes narrowed. I heard you were some kind of computer artist in California. What do you know about rebuilding a 289? The condescension in his voice ignited a spark of his father's temper in Mark. "I know enough to know your valve guides were shot and your timing chain was about to go. I know enough to have followed my father's process to the letter." He walked over to the engine, which was now fully assembled. "Why don't you see for yourself?" He handed Albright the keys. The old man looked skeptical but got in. He turned the key. The engine cranked once, twice, and then roared to life with a deep, throaty purr that was music to any gearhead's ears. It was a perfect, clean sound. Albright got out, a look of stunned respect on his face. "I'll be damned," he said. "Sounds better than it did in '65. He wrote a check for the balance on the spot. It was a significant amount, enough to cover the next mortgage payment. That evening, Mark went to the rehab center, the check feeling like a trophy in his pocket. He found his father in the physical therapy room, slowly walking on a treadmill, his face a mask of concentration and pain. "Dad," Mark said. Tony glanced over, his expression guarded. "Your mother said you've been at the house." "Not exactly," Mark said. He took a deep breath. "I've been at the shop." Tony stopped the treadmill, his shoulders stiffening. "What?" "I finished Mrs. Henderson's brakes. And I just finished Albright's Mustang." He held out the check. Tony took it, his eyes scanning the amount, then lifting to meet Mark's. The confusion in him was slowly replaced by a dawning, thunderous understanding. You had no right. Someone had to," Mark said, his voice steady. "The bills weren't going to pay themselves. I don't need your charity, Mark. I don't need you to swoop in and play the hero with my life's work." Tony's voice was rising, attracting the attention of a nurse. "It wasn't charity," Mark shot back, the dam of his own frustration finally breaking. "It was survival. For Mom, for you, for this family. This wasn't for you. This was for the man who taught me that when something is broken, you don't throw it away, you fix it. You taught me that." The words hung in the air between them. Tony was breathing heavily, his hand gripping the treadmill's rail. He looked from the check in his hand to his son's grease-stained jeans and tired eyes. He saw not the successful stranger from California, but the boy from the photograph, now a man, standing in his garage. The anger seemed to drain out of him, leaving behind a profound exhaustion. "Albright's Mustang," he said, his voice quiet. "You got it to start. The carburetor was always finicky. I followed the manual," Mark said, the fight going out of him too. "And I might have watched a few dozen videos." A ghost of a smile touched Tony's lips. "The manual's wrong on page 43. The torque specs for the head gaskets are off by 5 foot-pounds." Mark stared at him. "How did you know?" "Because I've rebuilt 3 of them," Tony said softly. He looked at his son, really looked at him, for the first time in over a decade. "You stayed. You fixed it." "I learned from the best," Mark said. Tony nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. He reached out a hand, not for a handshake, but to grip Mark's shoulder. The gesture was clumsy, unpracticed, but it carried the weight of every unsaid "I'm sorry" and "I'm proud of you" that had gone unspoken for years. "Come on," Tony said, his voice thick. "Help me back to my room. You can tell me how you managed it without blowing the whole thing to kingdom come." Later that night, Mark sat with his mother on the porch swing. The air was warm, filled with the scent of her roses. "He talked to me, Mom," Mark said. "Really talked. About the Mustang. About the business." Eleanor smiled, a deep, peaceful smile that reached her eyes. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I know." "How?" "Because he called me after you left. He said the shop is in good hands for now." She squeezed his arm. "You didn't just fix the cars, Marky. You fixed something else that was broken." Mark looked out at the quiet street, at the familiar shape of the maple tree his father had planted the day he was born. He had spent his life running from this place, from this man, from this version of himself. He had thought success was a skyline and a title. But here, covered in the grime of his father's legacy, he had stumbled upon a different kind of success. It wasn't about drawing pretty pictures or rebuilding engines. It was about showing up. It was about getting your hands dirty for the people you loved. It was, he realized, the most American thing of all, the hard, unglamorous, and ultimately beautiful work of redemption.